Okay, hello everyone. My name is Eric Masalski, and in this tutorial we're going to just be going over basically how to get around in the viewports in 3D Studio Max. So let's get started. If you could open up the file that came with this tutorial, or really almost any Max scene file, we just need something in there so we can see what's going on. Now, these are your viewports. You have top, front, left, and perspective by default. So, top, front, and left are orthographic views, meaning that they don't have any perspective in them. Perspective, as the name implies, uses perspective in its calculations. Now, we can switch viewports by left-clicking on its name, and you can see the cursor change. Right-clicking in a viewport, or left-clicking in a viewport. Now, one thing to keep in mind, though, is if you have a selection and you left-click in another viewport, you will lose that selection. But something also worth noting is you can also gain a selection in one of your other viewports. So what I've kind of grown accustomed to is if I have a selection already set up, I almost always just right-click to get around the different viewports. Okay, now you also have the option, if you right-click on your viewport name, get a drop-down list. At the very top are your views. This is where you can change what the current viewport represents. So now it's looking at the top, or say another perspective view, or say to the right. Back. You can also change the drawing mode. So we can go to smooth plus highlights, which gives us something very similar to the perspective view. You can go to wireframe, and underneath other, smooth facets. Facets just shows all the individual faces. Other flat. Flat is really nice because it removes all lighting calculations. So if you're baking lighting in your materials or into your texture maps, this is a nice way to test them to see how they look. It's also pretty helpful when doing a lot of low-level texture coordinate work because it allows you to see the textures as they are without any shading getting in the way. And one thing that's also pretty nifty is if you turn on edged faces in combination with smooth plus highlight, you'll see that it put edges, or it's pretty much a combination of the smooth highlight mode as well as wireframe mode. So this is very useful when doing a lot of low-level modification of an object. Okay, so let's get into actually moving and getting different views on our scene. So all of your viewport controls are down here on the right hand side. Alright, so at the top here we got zoom and zoom all. Now zoom, as you'd expect, click and drag in a viewport to zoom in. Next to that, zoom all does the same thing but for all viewports at once. Next to that is zoom extents. And whenever you see this little tab, as mentioned in previous tutorials, it means that we have additional options. So if we click and hold the mouse button down, we have a gray and a white box. So if we use the gray box, what this does is it zooms the entire scene so that it fits in your viewport. So if we're really far back, we click it, it brings us in. If we're really far in, it brings us back. Same holds true for the zoom extents all, on the right hand side. It'll do it for all viewports at the same time. Now, if we say select an object, and then we click and hold on our zoom extents button and choose the white box, this will zoom extents our selection. So it will zoom into our selection so it fits the entire viewport. Now if we don't have anything selected and we use the white box, it uses the entire scene. So we basically get both functionality, or the same functionality, just by using the white box. Zoom Extents All also has a white box option. Okay, so now let's make sure we have an orthographic view selected, and take a look at the bottom row. Now the first one is Zoom Region, so you can click and drag over an area and zoom right in. The next one to the right of that is Pan, so click and drag to move the view around. In addition to that, excuse me, in addition to that is Arc Rotate. Arc Rotate will allow you to rotate around your scene. So if you click and drag in the middle of the circle, see, you can rotate the view. Now, let's say for instance, I have this object selected over here, and this is the one I'm interested in. So if I rotate this around, oops, and this is set to the default gray, you can see it's a little hard to keep it in my sights. You know, it's jumping all over the viewport. But much like the Zoom Extents, we have several options. So the white option is Rotate Arc selected, and you can tell it now keeps that object in the right place, or in the same place, rotating around it. And the yellow option is Arc Rotate Subselection. And what this does is when you're working with subcomponents of an object, whether it be vertices, edges, faces, whatever, when you have one of those selected and you're modifying it, you can now rotate around that selection as well. I almost always keep it at the white. Okay, now in addition to clicking and dragging in the middle of the circle here, you can also click on the different boxes to rotate along a particular axis, or you can even click on the arc in between. But in all honesty, I've rarely ever used this arc one. It introduces some roll into a view and isn't all that useful for most cases. Usually you'd use a camera if you wanted more complex controls. Okay, so now let's switch over to perspective view. And our perspective view has many of the same options. One thing to notice is that the front view has no tabs underneath the zoom region or the hand. If we switch over to our perspective, we'll notice that the zoom region icon changes, as does the hand. It gets a little tab in the bottom. So let's first take a look at the first option here. This one changes the field of view for the perspective. Now if you need more complex controls than this, I highly recommend just putting a camera, which we'll go into detail in a future tutorial. Now if you click and hold the left mouse button down, you can get right back to your zoom region. So, oops, zoomed in too close. There we go. Okay, now another option, the hand, works in the same way as in the orthographic views, but if we click and hold the mouse button down, you see 2 footsteps. If we select that option, we're using their walk mode, and the walk mode is very useful, especially if you have an architectural or environment space. So for those of you familiar with first-person shooters, this is a very similar navigation mode. So if you could click and drag the mouse button down, and you change what you're looking at. You can press W on the keyboard to move forward, S on the keyboard to move back, A on the keyboard to move left, and D to move to the right. And so you can walk, or kind of more like fly, through your space just by constantly clicking and dragging the mouse and then pressing WAS or D. And so as you can see, this gives us very, very precise navigation controls for getting in to see various parts of our object or scene. So very, very useful, and I highly recommend you check it out. Okay, now the final option over here in our viewport controls is the maximize button. What this does is it toggles your active view to fill the entire screen or not. You can also do this through Alt-W. Now, while we're on the topic of hotkeys, let's go over a couple hotkeys to common controls down here. You can use the scroll wheel on your mouse to zoom in and out. You can hold down the middle mouse button to pan, or while holding down the middle mouse button, you can hold down Alt to rotate. Okay, so now we're going to look at how you can change the layout of your viewports. So the first option is to just resize the existing viewports. And you can do that by clicking and dragging in between the various viewports. You can see how the cursor changes. So you can click on any of these bars or move the cursor to their cross section and move them all at once, or resize them all at once. Okay, another option is to get a completely unique layout. So instead of this 4x4 grid layout. And we can do this by right-clicking on our perspective view, going down to Configure, and making sure that we're in the Layout section. You can see we have a couple presets here to choose from. So let's say I want this one. We can see what views are going to get assigned to which viewports. And we can change this by left-clicking on the name. So let's say I want that to be perspective, you to be top, you to be front, and you to be left. Click OK, and then it lays it out for you. You can now resize this even further if you want, or if you need to. Okay, and the final thing I want to show is undoing a viewport change. So say you find yourself zoomed in really close and it's not what you want. You can right click on the viewport name and go to Undo View Rotate. Now the viewport modifications are completely separate from what you do to your objects. So by undoing here, you're not going to change any modifications to your object. Now you can also press Shift Z, and that will undo your last viewport change. Okay, so that'll basically do it for viewports. I highly recommend you get comfortable navigating objects, isolating parts of an object, just really getting in and getting used to how the viewport controls work. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me or post on the forums. Okay, thanks.